to write everything down that's on the screen. We're gonna, after this webinar later this afternoon, we'll send over an email that has a link to the recording and also has a link to the PowerPoint slides. So we'll go ahead and get started here. We're excited to have Paul Sharon from Impact Data Source joining us today. Paul in Impact Data Source, we've been working with Impact Data Source. They are a strategic partner of the Retail Coach. We've worked with them for years. Paul knows his stuff. He knows impact analysis. He knows all that goes along with that. He's got a bachelor's of business administration degree from Temple University, and then also has a master of arts in economics from Clemson University. So as an economist and impact data source principal, Paul develops and provides support to their clients using their desktop and web-based software and models. So many of you on this webinar I know Paul, but he brings a lot of valuable insights. So Paul, we want to say thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Aaron. I appreciate it, and I'm really excited about being here and this topic that we're going to be looking at today.
Awesome. Well, many of y'all know me as well. Aaron Farmer here, Senior Vice President of the Retail Coach. But we'll go ahead and get started here. Real quick, just a short agenda. What we want to talk about today, I want to spend a few minutes talking about why retail. You know, what does retail bring to communities? What does it bring to your community? And then we want to shift into really Paul's part of this, determining the value of retail development in your community. So, you know, why retail? We get that question a lot, and I'll tell you, I remember 10 or 15 years ago, or even a little bit longer, many economic developers did not look at retail as economic development. But I'll tell you, as we sit here now, retail must be a component of your community's economic development strategy, whether it's a manufacturing or industry or office potential user that's looking to move into your community. Nowadays, they're looking for quality of life. Retail is part of quality of life. So I'll say that again, retail must be a component of your community's economic development strategy. Why retail? Really, there's a couple of things, and this isn't the whole list, but number one, I mentioned it already, quality of life. You know, especially the millennials, and we'll talk a little bit about millennials today, but they're looking for that quality of life. When they choose to decide where to live, what city they're going to live in, they look for retail. They look for quality of life and other things that go with retail. They really look for communities that have a little bit of everything. Is it retail? Is it entertainment? Is it food? Everything there, work as well. Also, retail brings in jobs. Might not be those primary jobs that come with, you know, office, industrial, manufacturing type organizations, but it does bring jobs into the community. Also, sales tax revenue. Many of, depending on the state that you're in, retail brings sales tax revenue directly to you. Some states have it where they distribute it evenly to municipalities throughout the state, but sales tax revenue is big. In Texas, we have Type A and Type B corporations in many of the cities that really benefit from the sales tax revenue, whether it's a cent, 1 cent or 2 cent that goes towards these quality of life type projects, goes towards economic development, infrastructure type projects, and then also property tax revenue. You know, retailers coming in, developers coming in, making an investment in your community. You also see that property tax revenue come in as well. So those are just a few of the things that we say why retail, but it's definitely important to focus on retail. We mentioned this already, but one of the things I think is interesting is as we look at quality of life, I remember in the past people would find a job and then they would move there. Well, what we're seeing now, especially with that younger age group, the millennials, many of these consumers are now choosing where they want to live first before they find a job. So deciding that, hey, we want to move to Austin, Texas, or we want to move to Denver, Colorado, and then finding a job based off of that. So it's important to have those quality of life aspects. We talked about retail being part of that, but this is a big trend we're seeing right now. mentioned this already, so I won't hit on it too long, but many of the large companies, whether it's industrial, manufacturing, office, they're looking for quality of life. I had a conversation at an economic development conference a couple of weeks ago with a site selector who helps these large companies choose sites, and he said they've got a list basically that all of the boxes have to be checked before the company will look at even locating the community. He worked for some of the larger ones, Apple, Google, some of the others. And part of that, he said, was quality of life. And especially if they're looking to recruit the younger talents, they're looking, like I said, for those communities that have everything. You know, is it a vibrant downtown? Is it a town center? Is it, shopping options? Is it making sure there's a grocery store there or restaurants? All of those things play into that. So it was really interesting to hear from an exec at one of these larger kind of tech companies saying, look, before we locate in a community, we have to make sure they have that. They're looking for the spouses and the children of those that they're going to be that are going to be working at the companies. Is there things for them to do? Is there that quality of life? Those are all the things that really go into those selection criteria. But before we transition into Paul's part of this, what I want to talk about is you as municipalities need to really take a look and conduct a land use analysis. If you were on our last webinar, we talked about how important it is to look at those sites in your community, whether they're new development or they're redevelopment, to determine are they serving their highest and best use. It could be a greenfield, it could be a vacant space, or it could be a property that needs redevelopment. It's important to look at those properties, understand their value they have now, but also determine the value of the project. If you were to bring in a casual sit-down restaurant, what would the value of that project, or what would the impact that project would have on your community from, sales tax standpoint to property tax standpoint to bringing in other retailers and restaurants, those sort of things, or is it a developer that's looking to come in? So one of the reasons we wanted to have Paul join us on this webinar is we get a lot of questions about, well, how do you determine the impact? How do you determine what's best for a site? And part of that is really just determining the value. What is the overall value that this project will bring now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and into the future? So we'll kind of use that as a segue into Paul's part of this, which is really determining the value of retail development in your community. So, Paul, thanks again for joining us. I want to hand this off to you, and really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron, and thanks for the introduction. Really appreciate you having us join you today to talk about this topic of valuing retail development. And when we talk about determining the value of a retail development or just an individual retailer in your community, we're talking about an economic development impact analysis. And so this approach can be applied across all types of economic development projects. So the typical kind of manufacturing or office, call center, even residential development, really any type of project. But today we're going to talk about, focus in on retail. And what we're talking about, again, though, is simply an economic development impact analysis. It's something that at my company, Impact Data Source, we kind of eat, breathe, and sleep. As Aaron kind of mentioned in the intro, we've been around for quite some time. We've got 20 years of experience kind of working almost exclusively with local or state governments and ED organizations. So what is economic development impact analysis? And I guess the reason we're using these terms kind of precisely, economic development impact analysis, is that we want to be specific that it goes beyond just economic impact. So it's more than just thinking about the jobs or the salaries and this kind of fuzzy concept that's called economic output that seems to trip up a lot of folks. So economic developers, as we know, need to go beyond those economic impacts, and they need to evaluate the deal, so to speak, so how everything comes together. And so in that context, you need to understand what we call fiscal impact, which is kind of just a fancy way of saying how the city or the county or the school district is affected by the project. So what are the additional revenues they might receive, and what are some additional costs they might bear. So essentially, we're trying to figure out who gets the revenue and what are those net revenues. And then the kind of thinking about this again, still as an entire deal, a package deal. Oh, if there are incentives to be considered in this, how do those incentives feed back into the analysis? And so one of the things, and Aaron kind of touched on some of these topics before the handoff there, but we want to think about some of the prerequisites before running an impact analysis. And so we have a due diligence checklist that we've put together, and this is more generic or more general for any type of economic development situation. But there's really kind of four things that we think about in terms of that overall due diligence. And so the first one is kind of the business background and just understanding in this context for retail, we might be thinking about a developer or maybe even the actual individual retail business. So it can kind of depend. When we say business background, it might mean the developer. But we want to just think about that that entity that you're working with. Is it the type of business that you want to kind of bring into the community? Is it someone that you want to do a deal with? So we're talking about the individuals behind the company, maybe their track record, what they actually sell or produce there. And then the next part is community fit, and this is where Aaron was touching on the preferences, kind of more and more, at least in the millennial age category, of kind of having a real strong preference for some of the quality life and amenities in an area. And so thinking about community fit is important as you're evaluating a prospective business or a prospective retailer or a development, and just trying to understand what is that actually going to do for your community. And so is it kind of taking you to where you want to go? I mean, as Aaron mentioned, if you don't have a grocery store and you can try to get a grocery store in your community, that could be a really big thing and really kind of move the community forward. The last two items in there that we're going to go into detail here are on the economic impact and the fiscal impact. And so that gets into some of these more quantitative numbers. But really the way we think about it, you have to kind of reach the hurdle or kind of exceed the hurdle there on the business background and community fit as you really think through these projects. As we get back to this idea, this concept of an impact analysis, we've got a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek recipe card for that. The ingredients, as we've kind of already talked about, is that we have at least one part economic analysis. So we are going to be looking at those jobs. Are there spin-off jobs that are generated from a project? In the case of retail, I'll tell you already, there's not going to be very many. The spin-off impact or those benefits from an economic impact standpoint for a retailer or a restaurant are relatively minimal. That's not really what you're necessarily interested in that type of project. For manufacturers and those other sorts of things where you're thinking about more of economic base type activity, that would be where you might see greater spin-off benefits. The second part there is, as we say, several parts fiscal analysis. There we're talking about, as we say, several parts, kind of understanding what's going to happen in terms of those revenues for each one of the taxing entities. So if you're the city, you might also want to understand what's going to happen for the county, what are the revenues that the school district will receive, and so on. And then finally, the third main ingredient being that incentive analysis. And so if there are incentives, if it's an infrastructure grant or if it's a sales tax rebate, perhaps, how does that feed back into this whole analysis so that you can kind of really get boiled down to the net analysis and maybe calculate the ROI. And so I've got an example here that I'll walk through, actually a couple examples. The first one I'm going to do is just a kind of a Chick-fil-A restaurant, which I think most of you hopefully are familiar with. If you're not, I definitely encourage it. But a Chick-fil-A restaurant, these are all relatively standard, so we're thinking of the kind of stereotypical Chick-fil-A restaurant. So it's about 4,500 square feet. Capital investment, somewhat modest there, about 1.35 million. We're going to say, and for our purposes, kind of split that up 50-50 between the building versus the equipment and so forth. And then they're going to have taxable sales. And actually, for as far as fast food restaurants go, Chick-fil-A has some of the highest sales per square foot in the industry. And so we've got $3.1 million in taxable sales, which is kind of the nationwide average, I believe. You may, depending on the specific one that's either in your community or that's coming to your community, you may see maybe less than that. I mean, those are pretty strong taxable sales. And then workers, we're just, again, 80 workers, that sounds like a lot. It certainly is. It's really a head count of workers, so that could be some combination of full-time and part-time. As you look at the average salary there, that's reflective of the fact that some of the 80 are working less than full-time.
You know, Paul, this is Chick-fil-A is a great one for us to look at first. I tell you, just about every community I go to wants a Chick-fil-A, so perfect one to choose.
That's great, and you'll see that from this, you can imagine other restaurants would be similar. So this, we'll look at a real kind of exciting example with the Chick-fil-A, but we can, these concepts would hold true and maybe just in different amounts across other types of restaurants. If we're talking about a Panera Bread or, Wendy's or anything else really. But based on these kind of project attributes, what we've done, I've gone ahead and modeled the impact of this, so kind of determining that value. And so in this example, let me pull up. Oh, I've kind of boiled it down to kind of what we're going to look at. So first off, we're going to try to get down to net benefits. So we see in that top orange bar, the net benefits essentially, very simply, are the revenues minus the costs. And so what are the revenues? We've got those listed there. In this case, we're going to be the scenario that I ran is for a Texas, stereotypical Texas community. So as my note at the bottom kind of indicates, that it's really the revenues and these calculations that you're getting into right now to calculate this fiscal impact is really dependent on the local tax structure. So if we were in a different state that only had, say, a state level sales tax, and then that was maybe distributed in state revenue sharing some way, that this analysis would need to obviously change. But for Texas, and surprisingly, there's a lot of communities or a lot of states that are kind of set up in the way that Texas is, in that the local city or the local county might receive some local sales taxes. So in our setup here, we've got revenues consisting of sales taxes, property taxes, some building permits and fees. So if there's going to be some construction with this new building, they may have to pay some revenues to the city, that we want to capture those. We've got utility revenue. That's as we're thinking about this, these are city-owned utilities. So if the city is providing maybe water, wastewater, solid waste, those sorts of services to the restaurant, we can pick that up as a revenue. I'll give you a sneak peek at the costs. We're gonna account for some of the costs on that side of the utility, on the city-owned utilities. But then we have utility franchise fees, which are kind of the utility franchise fees are typically charged to the utility provider. So for example, like electric or natural gas are common ones, where there might be a 4% or 5% franchise fee that's charged to that utility provider for the use of the right of ways throughout the city. And so to the extent that this project is going to be using some of those utilities, the city might see some increase in those revenues. And then we have just kind of a catch-all for some of these other revenues that the city might receive as just an overall increase in the general activity in the community. So things for some other taxes, charges, fines, and fees. And then on the cost side, as we already mentioned, the city-owned utilities will be one thing that we need to account for. So if we're accounting for the revenue, we want to balance that with the cost to provide utilities. In a lot of cases, what we see is that that a city will make a little bit of a margin as they provide utilities, maybe a small percent, somewhere around 5% maybe, of a profit margin, so to speak. So the cost, if they receive $1 in revenue for those utilities, the cost to provide those utilities might only be 95 cents. So that's what we want to investigate there. That comes through a number of different ways. Sometimes you just make transfers to the general fund from the utility fund, and so it's really getting into these details that are important for us. And then the other cost that we'll point out is just city services. And so as there's more, and I guess in the case of retail, you'll have kind of if it's a Chick-fil-A restaurant, you might have the need for all this, maybe there's more activity, more people around, you're going to want to think about the city's cost for public safety and some of those other things. So as I ran all of this information through, and I kind of put this in a kind of a hypothetical Texas city, and I came out with this summary. So on the left-hand side, we're just showing our economic impact. So what are the jobs that are being created? It was 80 direct jobs. There's just a handful of spin-off jobs. So about 90 in total in terms of that job creation. So there's really not, as we talked about already, there isn't a lot of spin-off impact from the jobs. With respect to salaries, also there's $20,000 average salary. The spin-off workers actually make a little bit more. So the average across all of the workers is about $22,000. And so again, if we're thinking about quality of jobs and so forth, and maybe indexing that based off of the income earnings of these workers, these aren't necessarily the highest quality jobs, but these are interesting or useful information to have and to know in the case even of retail. Capital investment, as we mentioned, was 1.35 million. And then we have something called residential development, which for retail, we don't really expect a lot of folks to necessarily move to the area to fill positions at this restaurant or a retail establishment. So it's relatively modest. We could have even zeroed it out maybe, but for the purposes of just kind of showing how all of these things come together, we can think about anytime that you have more employment opportunities in an area, you might expect to see some increase in folks living in the area or even residential construction. So that's in the gray bar to the left-hand side. That's how I think about economic impact. On the table here where we have the net benefits, this is really where we're getting down to the value of this Chick-fil-A. So we projected out over a 10-year period to see what the benefits would be to the city. So again, there's going to be benefits for the county and the school district, but this is focused just on the city. And again, it's over a 10-year period. So if we were to divide these maybe by 10 years, we might see that the net benefits would be roughly $62,000 per year. It may not go exactly in that order, but on average, that's what we're looking at. So the net benefits, the kind of that top line is $620,000. And then we can see what the benefits and what the costs are composed of. So we've got sales taxes that are about $525,000. That's the biggest driver. In this case, we can see that our benefits subtotal there is about $800,000. We have some costs of about $177,000 in total. And so our net benefits across this 10-year project is about $622,000. This is helpful just to get an understanding of kind of what's driving the analysis. As we kind of already knew going into this, something like a Chick-fil-A with $3 million in taxable sales each year, you could and relatively modest capital investment, you can be sure that the biggest driver, the biggest source of revenue for the city will be that sales tax. And so seeing these line items is helpful in just understanding kind of how this comes together. Now, what I want to do next is just show on that annual basis, what does that look like? And so this one isn't very exciting. You've got, in the first year, you're going to have maybe a little bit of extra impact from if there's some building permits and fees, or if there's some sales taxes related to that construction. But then beyond there, you're just kind of relatively flat, or maybe increasing just slightly, as this shows. So in other examples where maybe you're phasing in and it's multiple retail establishments coming on at various times, you would see either points where this jumps up a little bit higher, or maybe that it ramps up faster. In this case, that's not really happening in just this one Chick-fil-A. Now, if we want to think about how we can take that third part of the analysis, we've talked about economic impact, we've talked about fiscal impact, but now we want to evaluate incentives and see how that feeds back into the analysis. I'll kind of walk through two different examples and kind of see how they can even be layered on top of each other. So let's just, for an example, look at a sales tax rebate. And let's, for this example, think about a 50% sales tax rebate on the Chick-fil-A sales for 10 years. And so what's that going to do? It's going to reduce the sales tax revenues to the city, which of course reduces that overall net benefit to the city. And so this isn't necessarily an endorsement or a suggestion that you should do this, but we're going to just show how that comes back and affects the bottom line for the city. The other incentive that we can think about is maybe like an infrastructure grant if we need to get some site work done, or the city wants to or is thinking about assisting with some sort of infrastructure at that site. And for my example here, I'm just going to say maybe $150,000 for an infrastructure grant to be paid out up front. What we're going to do as we look at it here in just a slide or two, the infrastructure grant is going to be thought of as an investment, and that return on investment are going to be those net benefits that we're talking about that we've looked at. And so by having that kind of framework in place, we can calculate an ROI on that infrastructure grant based on what that Chick-fil-A restaurant will be doing for the city. So first off, let's stick with that sales tax rebate idea. So I've got a little bit of additional text here in our description of the project. So the city's considering a 50% rebate, and the city in this case has a 1.5% sales tax. And the value of that, if we kind of do the math on $3.1 million per year over 10 years, maybe there's a little increase, we rebate 50% of the 1.5% sales tax, that's about $250,000. So now we can look at our net benefits, and those net benefits have changed. If you remember before, it was over $600,000 as our top line net benefits. If you remember before, our sales taxes were about $525,000. And essentially by modeling the 50% sales tax rebate on those sales, our sales tax revenue and our net benefits have fallen by that amount of the $254,000. So this still has a positive net benefit over 10 years. We're still looking at over $300,000, over $350,000 in net benefits over the time period, but it's certainly not as high as when before we considered that sales tax rebate. Now, let's assume now that we want to add that incentive analysis. And so we kind of typically do this with a graph here that helps us see it. So this is before we enter in that incentive, we're taking a look at our setup here. So as I mentioned, the return on the investment is going to be equal to the net benefits to the city, and that's what we're graphing here in this chart. This orange line is showing us the cumulative net benefits to the city. If we remember from that previous slide, it was about $360,000, $368,000, and that's where we're at right here. And this by year 10, it stretches up to $368,000. You can see it's relatively kind of a straightforward line. As we mentioned, there isn't a real any big ups or down in the net benefits over the time period. Now, if we want to say, let's add in, we've got the sales tax rebate in there, because remember the $368,000 was with the sales tax rebate. What if, in addition to that, we wanted to offer a $150,000 infrastructure grant? And so we're going to represent that infrastructure grant, that incentive, that investment as the blue box shown it paid out in year 1. And we have a dark blue dashed reference line to kind of show us the total value of that $150,000 incentive stretching across. And where it intersects our orange line, that shows us our payback period. That shows us where the city will have recovered enough money in net benefits to cover the value of that incentive. So basically, by just about, if we're looking at the graph, just about year 4, we can see that the city has received $150,000 in net benefits by that point, and that will be the payback point of this infrastructure grant. And we can see we've calculated kind of precisely there, and it is exactly 4 years. We've got a rate of return of just about 25%, and if we were to divide that incentive out by the 80 jobs, we can see what that looks like on a per job basis. Now, this is, again, I'll point out that this infrastructure grant plus the sales tax rebate. Let's say that maybe it was an either-or option, and that you weren't going to offer that sales tax rebate, which would then mean that your net benefits jump back up to $600,000, but you were just going to consider the infrastructure grant. So what that means is your payback period would drop and your rate of return would increase. And so we can take a look at just the infrastructure grant, adding back in and kind of removing that sales tax rebate option. And now our net benefits stretch up to year 10 at $622,000. And we see that payback period falls from 4 years back to 2.4 years for that same $150,000 incentive. And so this is kind of a helpful way to think about in economic development what you're doing if you've got incentives and you want to compare that to kind of what the city receives from that. Again, this could be the EDC or something like that, working on behalf of the city. And so we compare to what the city receives as a result of this project. The analysis, as we've calculated, although we've focused entirely on the city, we've calculated the benefits across all of the taxing entities. So here, again, my generic names, but we've got the city listed, we've got the county, school district, and then some other just property taxing districts. And in my case, I had a road district and a water district. You might have a college or a library or a hospital district. There's all different sorts of things, but we would want to understand what tax revenue they might receive, and that in those cases it might just be property taxes. In school districts, you're generally looking at maybe some state funding or different things like that, and the cost to educate students. But getting a good view of all of the taxing districts is helpful. Although, like I've said, we've been focusing on incentives, say from the city, so we want to compare the return on that city's incentive to just what the city will receive. It's important, though, maybe to consider all of the taxing districts. Now, what we just looked at, again, was that single Chick-fil-A restaurant, but we might think about a larger retail development. And so in this case, what I'm going to walk through is a scenario that we've modeled with a Walmart supercenter retail development and inclusive of some additional retail with some essentially junior anchors and some other retail tenants and maybe some pad sites with restaurants. So first off, just to kind of define what we're talking about with our Walmart, I kind of have the stereotypical supercenter of 190,000 square feet. I've got a capital investment of just over $20 million. There's going to be some taxable inventories in Texas. Again, this is a Texas setup that I've got going. Texas taxes inventory, so we're going to pick up some revenue from that for the city. And this Walmart will have a pretty significant number of taxable sales in a year. And I've got the workers shown there again, and we're going to use that same average salary of about, or average earnings of about $20,000. Again, some of those workers, as you know, will probably be part-time. So this is just the Walmart portion of it. If we add to that kind of some of this various other retail, including these junior anchors, other retail tenants, and some pad site restaurants, we're going to have about a total of 147,000 square feet to be constructed. That capital investment is going to be just under $20 million. We've got some more taxable inventories, and we've got some more taxable sales. And you can see the assumptions that we have there for those. And so we've got this whole retail development site plan. So this is kind of a mix of some of the projects that we've worked on just in the last few months even. As we step forward on this, I've kind of broken this out for us so that we can kind of see in columns what's happening just specifically maybe for the Walmart and then also for this various other retail. And we could even break it down further as I mentioned, there's some junior tenants, and so we could break out this various retail even into smaller line items so that you could see exactly what happens. But at the top line, if we just look at the total across the Walmart itself and this other various retail, we've got total net benefits of about $14 million over 10 years. Again, all of these numbers are over a 10-year period as we're trying to look out as best we can. And if we look again for a retail establishment or retail heavy establishment, the sales tax is the biggest driver of this overall. So if we're looking at the top line of total 14.6 million in net benefits, 12.2 million is coming straight from the sales tax revenue. And so that can help you understand again where you're getting your revenue, what's the important part of this. You know, sometimes you can get bogged down in trying to understand the capital investment and how much that property may come onto the tax rolls for. And you know, you can see in this case certainly $1.2 million, and then we're going to add to that some others. It's almost about between the different types of property. We've got real FF&E and inventory itemized here. You can see that's about $2 million. So $2 million in property tax revenue over 10 years is certainly significant, but as you can see, it kind of pales in comparison to the sales tax revenue, which is really driving the majority of this analysis. So as I look at this, as I think about this project, I feel that the analysis is pretty sensitive to those sales tax numbers. And so we might want to think about going back and saying, well, were those sales per square foot estimates reasonable, maybe nationally, or were they even reasonable for our community? Do we think we're going to be at that national average for sales per square foot of a Walmart or of those other, other retail establishments? And so if you weren't really certain of that, or if you wanted to kind of just run a scenario, what you could do is maybe say, look, let's say that we only hit 75% of their sales tax target, or the sales taxable sales targets. Maybe that's due to the fact that, you just don't produce that as, those industry standard average sales in your community, or even maybe there's occupancy problems and things don't get leased up quite as you expect. So if we did that, what I did in this next slide is to say that they said they were going to hit, that $35 million in taxable sales at the Walmart each year. Let's say that they only hit 75% of that. And the same is true for maybe the various retail. If they only do 75% of their sales, how does that affect our analysis? And you can see our property taxes and some of these other things have not changed, but our sales tax number has dropped. And I think we're at 14.6 before. Now we're down to 11.6 million in net benefits across the 10 years. That's certainly a significant drop, but we can still see what we're looking at. And now, to the extent that maybe a 75% sales scenario affects the viability of the overall project, that hasn't really been considered here. But you can do certain types of analysis just to try to get a little bit more comfortable about what is really driving the overall numbers. And that, again, in this case, we're trying to add up multiple establishments, multiple retail or restaurants components into an overall development scheme to try to understand what that's going to look like. And in those cases, a lot of times what we see is potentially, as a city is trying to encourage this type of development, they might be looking at some financing sources that they, maybe if it's a certain kind of a bond or something like that can be backed by some of the sales tax revenues. And just trying to see how that whole deal comes together. But using these numbers, really getting down to these net benefits, can help you kind of take those next steps of working on some creative financing to make this kind of development happen. Aaron touched on this earlier, and so if we think about this is left as a question almost, as retail development as economic development, and so these are things that I think are true as we've kind of walked through the analysis that I've shown here. But for communities with a local sales tax, retail developments can provide a large source of revenue. We've seen that. If you don't have a local sales tax, or you don't get revenue directly from that sales tax, it really has much less of an impact for you. It'll be much more modest. And then for communities without much retail, in the area immediately, the retail development or new retail development can really improve the quality of life for residents. And so it prevents, or it kind of cures that problem of folks needing to kind of take that weekly trip to the grocery store or maybe even monthly trip to the Walmart in a town that's maybe a little bit further away. Now, as we think about this, just again from economic impact standpoints, destination retail, those are things where maybe they have a larger draw. It's not just a grocery store where maybe everybody that goes to the grocery store is a local, but things like the Cabela's or the Bass Pro Shops, things that are drawing folks from a larger area. That destination retail has the potential to kind of draw new dollars into your community. But there's a few things you should think about with that. So the nature of retail just is such that very few of those retail dollars actually stay in the economy. So you may get some of the sales tax revenue from there. The workers, are going to have some jobs, but you think about the retail products; those are not really manufactured in the area. They're kind of coming into that store and then going out with the customers. There's not really a lot of benefit that might spin off through the economy in the same way as if products were actually manufactured there in your economy or in your area. And then obviously the profits from retail businesses will probably go back to that corporate owner located outside of the area. And so the point here is just that understand that with retail like this, even on destination retail, a lot of those dollars are not going to stay in the economy. They're going to be going other places. another thing to be aware of, and I mean, I think it's probably pretty clear. It's not that folks really see the jobs from retail being some sort of end all be all, but the jobs are relatively low paying. They probably don't provide a lot of opportunities for advancement. But at the same time, you have that that you have that income that could be generated for individuals in your community. And so just to sit back and say, well, we only want to employ CEOs in our community, that's going to be a tough sell in a lot of cases. So there's certainly an argument for jobs, even if they're more modest paying like these related with retail. You just want to understand their place. And then the final line item here is, should we really be offering an incentive for retail development? And I think the answer to that really goes back to kind of what we looked at on that due diligence checklist, and understanding the role that the retail development will play in the community and kind of taking it to where it needs to be. And so if some of those questions can be answered kind of satisfactorily, then I think it may make sense. But in many cases, it may not be the best use of economic development efforts in kind of just chasing some of these retail projects.
Yeah, Paul, let me add a little bit to that too. I know you and I have had this discussion before, but we're not huge fans of incentives at the retail coach unless it's projects that are going to have a larger impact on the community. So, is it going to is that development or that retailer that's coming in, is it going to increase the size of the retail trade area? Is there significant, sales tax revenue? But, we really stress to our clients that you need to look at what is that overall impact, kind of what you've looked at today, Paul, because there are different incentive options out there, whether it's a 380, sales tax rebate agreement, or whether it's, from some infrastructure improvement or just some infrastructure incentives, to really look at what you talked about here, that overall value of the incentive. Where do you get the most bang for the buck if you are going to incentivize retail? So just wanted to add a little bit to that.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think you have kind of the right angle there on it. I mean, if you can kind of wrap it into the overall kind of the strategic plan, so to speak, in the economic development terms, the strategic plan for the community, and understanding what role retail will play and how you can help get there. And even apart from those kind of hard dollar incentives, as you might be thinking about, just assisting with retail development from an economic developer for all of these other things that economic developers do that isn't just necessarily making a contract or a deal on something, but all the other support that you can do to kind of encourage the retail development. Those are important things, and understanding the value of the retail will help you kind of see that those are a good use of your time.
Absolutely.
I got just a couple more slides here. I've got a couple screenshots I'll just go through briefly here. These screenshots are essentially of our online model impact dashboard, which I used to produce kind of all of these the materials today. And you can see in this example, I've got a manufacturing project that I'm looking at. So retail, manufacturing, headquarters, any of these different things, we can kind of run through the model and kind of boil it down to those net benefits in this same approach. And so we've just got a handful of screenshots of that. And then I want to talk about, just finally here, kind of getting back to this final idea of economic development impact analysis and some of the final benefits of it for economic developers or cities and even states. Using an economic development impact analysis is a way to kind of undertake a consistent methodology and messaging. So you're able to, as you boil everything down to those net benefits, you can compare kind of on a common basis, no matter what the type of project is. So if it's retail, you can look at net benefits. If it's manufacturing, you can boil that down to net benefits. Maybe it's a little bit heavier on the property taxes in that case, and less heavy on sales taxes. For headquarters, for even events that happen throughout the year, all of those types of projects can be boiled down to net benefits, and then you can be able to compare those or think back as you work on multiple projects over time. How your approach changes depending on what type of project it is. using a model or using an impact analysis like this, the board and council, city council can really understand and get comfortable with the approach. They know that it's not just some sort of ad hoc analysis that was thrown together by the retail developer that showed only the good sides of the project. But if you're going to have if you implement kind of a standard process, you'll know that all projects are scored kind of on that same basis. And as an economic developer, I think it really helps you communicate effectively kind of with everyone. So if you're in the middle there, you think about dealing with the business or consultants or even that developer, you're trying to kind of explain, what you're looking at, what you're up against, what you're trying to how you're trying to value the project. And then as you're communicating with your board or your city council, it's kind of the same thing. You're saying, look, these are more or less some quantitative numbers that this is the benefit that we'll get from it, and it's a standard process. Overall, just as we've talked about, it kind of gives you that 360-degree view of the project, so you can kind of look at it from multiple angles, not just zeroing in on sales tax, not just zeroing in on, oh well, it's they only make $20,000 a year in those jobs, whatever it is. It really gives you a full view of the project. And then finally, if we are kind of getting into some sort of agreement, economic development agreement, it really helps you set up the compliance and performance to understand what's important. And if they don't hit, like we said, if we don't hit their sales taxable sales target, the sales tax revenue target, if they miss it by $1, how bad is that? If you miss it by $1, you know that that's not that bad. But say you miss it by 75%, we already know that scenario. We can see that it's still pretty significant net benefits if that were the case of that one example. So I think that's the end of my slides. And Aaron, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, well, first off, Paul, thanks a lot. I mean, that was, I know, really enlightening for me, and I know it was for a lot of the attendees on here. We've got a couple of questions that have come in that we'll go ahead and try to answer between the two of us. And then just if you have questions right now, feel free to type them into the question box in the control panel there, and we'll try to get to them. But Paul, the first question is really towards you. It says, are per capita economic impact studies of proposed developments worthwhile? Should case studies be preferred? Do you have a thought on that?
Well, I guess there's a balance. I think I understand what we're getting at there, and there's a balance that needs to be taken there. There's not going to be a case study that shows exactly what's happening in your community, the development that's planned exactly for your community and what that's going to mean there. I think there is a danger maybe in just taking at face value what the developer says even the tenants, if you're looking at, again, the national data about this is what our sales typically do. You might want to, as I say, kind of run some scenarios. I think it's important that you get specific enough that you're able to model exactly what is being planned for your community. So I don't think there's any case study out there that's going to show you exactly what's going to happen for your community as this project comes along. So getting into modeling exactly what is proposed. And then I think the idea of using a case study to me would be so that you can and I may have this wrong, but my idea on why you would be using a case study is to kind of see what happens, what these eventualities are. Do they produce what they say they're going to, and so forth. And just that analysis that I walked through there of doing a scenario to say, well, and we could do it on the Chick-fil-A restaurant too. So let's say they don't hit $3.1 million, and so maybe we need to go in and put a little bit lower taxable sales there. Maybe we just put it at $2 million to be super conservative and see what that looks like. But being able to do those kind of scenarios, that what if, I think is really the way to handle it, and gives you that, really specific analysis. And I mean, honestly, if it were, I think the point of this to me is that these aren't necessarily that expensive to do. And so going out and looking at case studies and that sort of thing, I think would, if that case study approach was used to kind of save money or time, I don't know that that's necessarily going to be the case.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Another question we just had come in. It's our issue as a city is drawing in the retail. would you say that giving incentives, like mentioned a few slides ago, is the best way to draw in retail? And I'll kind of take that one, Paul.
Mhm.
Like I mentioned before, we're not huge fans of incentives at the Retail Coach, but they're necessary in certain situations. But I'll tell you a story. Incentives do not close the deal necessarily for a retailer. Retailers want to go. They look at the community where they look at the sites where they're going to have the highest return on investment for them. So we were working a project in community, southern Oklahoma, and this community, believe it or not, offered about $250,000 just cash to this retailer that was looking to come in. The community south of them didn't offer anything, and that retailer still went to that community south. So incentives are not the kind of end all be all. What you have to do as a community is just show that there is value to this retailer. Show them that, hey, this is where my consumers are coming from. We have a large enough trade area to support you. This is where you're going to pull from. So you're going to have to work a little bit harder to convince these retailers and restaurants that incentives might help, but that's not the only way to get a retailer in there. It might be part of the process, but you really need to be able to show to these retailers, to these restaurants, developers, that you have a trade area that will support their business, that you have enough people there, the incomes in the community, those sort of things. So the quick answer is, incentives are not the only answer. But hopefully, hopefully you can show that there is a benefit to them coming to the community, be able to show them that this is what they could do from a sales standpoint, and even that impact analysis would help as well from that standpoint. Paul, would your models? Another question: would your models be used in TIF incentives also?
Yeah, absolutely. We've done, and so we work a couple different ways. We have models, like web-based models that we customize and put out there for clients, and we can build into that tax increment financing districts where either maybe the entire city's portion or county's portion of the property tax rate is kind of put into the TIF and diverted from the city's actual line item. Or maybe it's a percentage of the city or county. But yes, we've done those again as a model, as kind of a tool that our clients can use. But we also do studies kind of on an individual basis too, on kind of on a one-off or as needed basis for some of the more unique development scenarios. That would be what we would probably recommend, might be the easiest way to do it. But our model, our online model and desktop models can handle quite a bit too. But certainly TIFs are fair game in those.
Another question headed your way. Are the sales figures for the development provided by the retailers? And if they don't meet those sales figures that are provided, can the incentive be revised?
Yeah, so I would say that getting information from the developer or by the actual retail tenants or the proposed retail tenants would be a good place to start. A lot of times they may have access to other, kind of the national sales data that you can't necessarily find. But I would definitely, number one, kind of at a first blush, probably before you get done reading the email, just do a sanity check on it to say, like, does that seem reasonable that they're going to have $9,000 in sales per square foot? And if it was $9,000, I would say, no, that's not reasonable. But there are a number of sources and if you just need to run something by somebody, you can certainly send me an email. But we buy a number of data sources that we can look at and see for different types of businesses what they report as their sales per unit or sales per square foot. A lot of that information, especially for publicly traded companies, is available kind of in their financials that they have to produce annually. So a lot of that information is out there that you can kind of do some sanity checks on. Again, I would suggest that, if your community, if you want to be a little bit conservative, you say, well, maybe we're not exactly the national average, we can pull back from that. Even if you think maybe, hopefully, fingers crossed, it'll be, exceed that national average, maybe you just start a little bit lower. From the second part of that question, if they don't meet certain sales figures, can you revise the incentive? On those kinds of things, it all depends on what the incentive is that you're considering. If it's a sales tax rebate, I mean, in those cases, it would be tied to, exactly what your sales are. So if you tell me you're going to have $1 billion in sales, but then you only have $1 million in sales, Well, you only get the rebate off of what you actually did. On other things, it may be if you're phasing it out and not paying it all up front necessarily, those can be adjusted over time. Certainly, the tying it to their actual output is the best way to do it, in my opinion, just so that you don't get into situations where you've paid things up front and now you need to try and go get that back. Things like infrastructure are a little bit less. As I mentioned before, we were thinking about an infrastructure grant, say of 150,000. Those things, hopefully that infrastructure they can't kind of pack up and take with them. And so to the extent that maybe the business fails or that things don't work out, that maybe they're not going to dig up the water line or take those curbs with them. And so you'll still retain that as a benefit.
Perfect. Well, I think that's all the questions today. I've got on the screen Paul's contact info there, and also myself, our contact info. And what we'll do is later this afternoon we will be sending out an email to everyone that has, again, a link to the webinar. It also has the PowerPoint presentation. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or Paul at impactdatasource.com. And, we'll be happy to help in any way we can. So, again, Paul, thanks a lot for joining us. And I want to thank all the attendees for sticking with us. And y'all have a good rest of the day. Thank you.